Trey's notes, and it should be pretty straightforward that way. Okay, so Trey, take it away, man. Good to have you on board.
Well, same here. Good to be here. Um, Second dynamic's a very interesting area because as Ellery says, it's a kind of a specialized third dynamic, specialized group. It has a specific purpose of, um, home, family, children, those kinds of things. And I made an earlier uh, video which is posted there, like how to create a sane marriage, and then it talks about the sanity scale, and the sanity scale is a scale of how you can put together a group, and how you can put together a sane group. So it's easier when you talk about choosing a partner. It's easier to think of it as creating a team than purely affinity, because you can have affinity for a lot of people, but a lot of people wouldn't have the desire or ability to be part of a team, like a two-person team at first, and then extending that to whatever family you might have as well. So there's a lot of data on how to. So it's really you've got an org board, a second dynamic org board, and there's nobody filling that spot of a mate. And so you want to fill that spot. Well, first of all, that spot has to be vacant. You can't have an old girlfriend from high school still filling it, even though she's long gone. You'd have to figure out how you can really end cycle on all past 2Ds. And then you have an open spot, and then there's something to fill. Somebody can take the post or take the job or want to be part of that team. So there's a lot of admin tech on how to hire. And that's the first step of the Sandy scale, is like, how do you hire a mate? And that's essential. The essential part of that is qualifications. What are the qualifications? Well, in an org, LRH will hire anybody to be part of the org except people who cannot be trained, because the first step of sanity scale is hiring, and the second step is training. Now, you'd have to figure out how that applies to the second dynamic. Not that you would want just anybody as a mate, but if you find whatever your qualifications are, it could be, tone level, ability, attractiveness, could be a lot of different things. So you have to figure out what really is um, qualifications that are not arbitrary, like she has to have blue eyes or something, non-essential like that. Then you can you can interview, you can go out on dates, you can talk to people. There are 5 things to look for that would be immediate deal breakers. And one, like if you start to have a relationship with somebody, you get to know somebody a little bit before you get too involved with them. If they're mentally or physically abusive, run for the hills. If they're drug or alcohol abusers, they'll break your heart, guaranteed. Criminals, obviously, you don't want to get into legal trouble by being associated with criminals. Plus, criminals don't make good husbands. Somebody who's promiscuous and has a great desire for variety, that really undermines the coherence of a family and shouldn't be tolerated. And the last thing is somebody who can't work. Somebody who's had, they're 22 years old and they've already had 15 jobs or no jobs. That, you're going to need resources in your family. And in order to gather resources for your family, you'd have to produce an exchange, unless you're just being parasitic or a criminal, which we've already eliminated that. So that's not a problem. So once you found a suitable mate, and then training comes in, which is the adjustments that you make. If you establish that you have similar values, aligned importances, goals that don't conflict with each other. The top of the admin scale is pretty solid. Then you can start working on the down parts of the admin scale, making plans, working out programs, projects, figuring out how you're going to evaluate your progress, which is all just part of doing an admin scale. And those are very, very useful in a 2D. They're particularly useful before you create a 2D, because then you know very clearly what you want, and that gives you a much better ability to pull something in that really fulfills that. So, being trained means, in this sense, means making adjustments to the situation. The more you learn about your partner, the more you know what the likes and dislikes are, and what's acceptable and not acceptable. And gradually you're forming the game, because you're figuring out the rules of the game. Doing this is very upsetting to your partner, and doing that is very pleasing to your partner. So you figure out these things, and you start to do those things, if you really want to have a sane 2D. And then you gradually integrate your lives together, and that's apprenticeship. That would be like an engagement. Utilization is posting, which is, okay, let's get married, let's have kids, let's do what we want to do, or let's not have kids. There's no real I'm supposed to or have to about it. It's just what two people agree on, and what they can mutually create together. Now, once you've established a good 2D, then really it's a question of maintaining it, and maintaining a high level of cooperation and understanding with each other. Now, the definition of public relations is how to achieve agreement and cooperation from the group. And in this case, you could say it's the same thing: how to achieve agreement and cooperation on mutually agreed upon goals, purposes, plans, policies, so that you're not getting in each other's way, but your actions are contributing to the other's well-being and survival. That's the goal. And you can achieve that by maintaining ARC. ARC is the tech, PR is the tech of ARC. So people object to the word PR, but that's what it is. It's public, your public relations, but your public is your wife or your kids, or your wife's family, for that matter. LRH, in a recent article that I read, it's an old article from the early 50s. He says that communication by 1,000% is much more important than affinity or reality. And he talks about the fact that affinity can only occur if you're in common with something. You can't have affinity for something you have no communication line with. And when you're in communication with someone, you can smooth out the wrinkles in your reality differences. Everybody has reality differences. The question is, how do you smooth those out in order to come to, as we said, cooperation and agreement? So maintaining good communication in a relationship is absolutely essential to its continuation and its stability. Now, stability is very important in a relationship. It's one of the reasons why you don't, those 5 things I said earlier, you want to avoid, because you can't have a stable relationship with an unstable person. It's just not possible. If you're going to have a 2D with somebody, it has to be somebody whose first dynamic is in decent shape, because otherwise the first dynamic problems will pull you down. the dynamics, and then all your time is spent handling your mate's problems. And there's no out-facing production and exchange to produce resources for the second dynamic. So when you're pretty much on the same team, and LRH defines that as monitoring the actions of another without interfering with them. That's the benefit of having a good admin scale, is you don't end up interfering with each other. You end up supporting each other because you agree and understand what the other person would like to have. They may not be your goals, but they're still worthwhile. Somebody has health goals, you can help them with their health goals, not undermine them, So anyway, so getting back to ARC, communication being way important, because the other two, affinity, reality, and understanding, are very dependent on communication. Now, there's some real basic communication errors to avoid when you are in a marriage. Now, that's a definition of communication there on the board. That's a good one. There's a word in Scientology called "not is," and what it means is saying something that is not. It's a denial of a reality or a situation. One way of denying a reality or situation is to play it down, to make little of it, or make nothing of it. No, I've seen this quite a bit. I've done a lot of couples counseling, and the wife will say, complain about this, that, the other, and the husband will say, well, but she shouldn't feel that way. Well, that's not is. She shouldn't feel that way. Well, she does feel that way. So let's deal with that, and maybe we can get through it. Because as long as you're saying that shouldn't exist, it's very hard to change it, because the person has to assert it, because their reality is being denied or undermined. So it's not being accepted, which means that it's not traveling along a communication line to the receipt point, being duplicated and as is, so that the reality differences can be sort of smoothed out, as we were saying before. There's also a major disease that people get into when they get married, which is called spousal deafness. Now, when you've been around somebody a long time and you think you know what they're going to say, then you don't really tune into them when they're talking to you. And like somebody, like the wife says, I'm going to do this, and that today. And then later on that day, the husband says, hey, well, what did you do today? That's unfortunately a fairly common example. Now, women are usually a lot better at social skills than men. So this is primarily a male disease. The other one that defines mostly males are being a fast listener. Now, a fast listener is they start to listen to you, but then they kind of know what you're going to say, so they just stop listening. So same thing, the comm cycle goes out. And when the comm cycle goes out, reality differences build up, and you get too much reality build up, you get reality gaps. And when you get reality gaps, you get people operating independently, and there's a major departure from understanding and cooperation. Your second dynamic motions and products are not aligned and can even be in conflict. And that's why you end up getting two people living in the same house with completely different realities. Realities have to be acknowledged, and the only way that happens is with a calm cycle. And the other thing that I noticed in dealing with people in marriage counseling is that the calm cycles were awful. They were cutting each other's calm, not acknowledging, saying, but that's not true, or, contradicting, denying. There wasn't just sitting there listening to the other person, then acknowledging them. There was defending and attacking, and all of those things are bad comm cycle, bad ARC. That's why you can end up arguing about the same thing for years, or why your spouse keeps saying the same thing over and over again. Well, or it says when people say the same thing over and over again, they feel like they've never really been duplicated, and they're trying to get across something that's important to them, but they're not getting any kind of feedback that shows that they're being successful at doing that. So they just keep repeating it. So these are clues as to what the comm errors are in a relationship. And when I do 2D counseling, I mostly concentrate initially on the comm cycle, because nothing else is going to get resolved if people are just in op-term situations with each other. Now, what I mean by op-term situations with each other goes back to this idea of a team. A team has an opponent. You formed a group together in order for cooperation, also protection, good survival. Elroy says that the best opponent to have is the physical universe. When you're in a 2D, your interaction is with the third dynamic, the fourth dynamic, all the other dynamics, and you're going to get the resources that you need to survive from those dynamics. So you have to be in common with those dynamics. When another really important basic is the basics of like what a game is. A game and a game and a no game. You have a no game with a partner or a teammate, going back to being a teammate. Now, when you withhold information, when you have an opponent, you withhold information from them. Like you're in a war, you don't want your opponent knowing what your strategy is. So by A equals A, when you withhold from a mate, you position them as an opponent or a rival or an enemy or someone to be fooled or manipulated. And on a very deep level, people can sense this, whether they're with the program or they're against the program. So when you start to oppose your mate, you key in the whole GPM bank. And the GPM bank has to do with old and current games that you're playing that are reactive in nature for the most part. For most people aren't really aware of the game that they're reacting to, but they have little bits and pieces of this game that's really was what their case is all of these old GPM restimulations that occur, where there's things that you oppose and things that you want to have on your team, and things you want to accumulate the tools of the game. You want the havingness of a teammate, and when you have an opponent, you deny the opponent that their goal, which is their goal, is to defeat you. And when you have a teammate, you support the teammate's goal. So it goes right back to the beginning of the admin scale. If you support your mate's goals, then by definition, you're creating a team. If you haven't established mutually agreed upon or aligned goals, then you can get other goals that are coming into the act that get opposed. And when they get opposed, it really locks in this you and the opposition form of games, not teammate forms of games. They're opponent forms of games. And the other hallmark of a game is that you win and they lose. So when your mate becomes an opponent, you want them to lose. And so they're in the game too. They want you to lose. So then there's all kinds of old strategies from way back on the track that come into play about how are you going to beat your opponent and keep them from beating you. So the point is that none of these things are anything that you really want to get into when you're married, but it's very instructional to understand that this is why things that start out so well end up in a miserable mess and even a real war like that movie The War of the Roses, where they end up destroying everything in order to spite their mate. But it happens, and this is why. What's the first thing that goes out? The comm cycle. Comm cycle goes out, ARC goes out, start to build up an oppositional position with your mate or your children, for that matter. I mean, all of these things apply to your kids too. And then, unless it's repaired, it goes south. Now, repairing it involves putting back in the comm cycle and communicating about things with the comm cycle until good ARC is achieved. Now, you can have good ARC on not being together. That's always been my goal when I work with couples. Like, I don't know if they should be together or not. It's not up to me. If they can come to a good agreement, then whatever that agreement is good for both of them. Probably they have conflicting goals, because if they have conflicting goals, they're going to never have a satisfying relationship because their goals oppose. If they just differ on policies or plans, those things can be worked out. That's not a big deal. That's very, very doable. Well, as far as the other part of the Admin scale, we talked about communication, we talked about reality, and affinity is very important. When you express affinity, you're expressing affinity for the beingness of your mate, their physical presence, their possessions. That's, respecting their space, their nest, taking care of it as if it were your own. And it's very important to give each other physical representations of high affinity, a hug or kiss or just a verbal expression. Of course, it could become mechanical. You say, "Oh, I love you too." But it was sincerely expressed. There's nothing like it. It really is the bonding that allows you desire that bonding because you desire to be part of the dynamics, and you can achieve that bonding through communication. So you achieve affinity through communication and having realities that don't clash. So that's how the second dynamic goes off the rails and how the second dynamic can be repaired. It's a pretty simple solution if you really understand what the mechanisms are. In other words, a lot of Scientology and a lot of auditing and a lot of the tech is, well, you got yourself into it. How do you get yourself out of it? Even in auditing, you get a read on something, it means you've gotten yourself into something. You go earlier, similar, you look at it, what's your decision? Bang, you're out of it. How do you get into things? How do you get out of things? That's kind of summarizes the tech. That's a good way of looking at it. And so, if you understand the sequence of putting together a team, and you can see if you have problems with one area, you go earlier and you see, oh, maybe maybe it was a mishire, or maybe there's some training that's needed, or maybe we never focused on this area here and got it into a working condition. And then putting in the comm cycle too. So the admin scale and the comm cycle, very, very, and the sanity scale are very, very important to establishing and maintaining a sane 2D. And that's my talk. So I'm open to any questions that anybody might have. Oh, there's sex on the screen there. Sex in the Screen should be a TV show. Uh, anyway, yeah, one of the things that you should have reality on and agreement is, sexual activity, how often, what, when, um, in what manner. Well, these things can be worked out. You don't want somebody with really, really exotic sexual preferences, probably, but you that would tend to belong a lot to these four types of people that I mentioned before, um, which is your antisocial people that aren't trained, can't be trained, and they tend to be more aberrated. Um, but yeah, you tend to find that out when you're dating, whether you're sexually compatible or not. Usually, you don't marry somebody where you're not have some sexual compatibility. Um, the problem is that can change over time because that's a reality and affinity and a communication activity. So when communication goes out, that tends to go out too, or becomes mechanical, which is a lot less satisfying. Well, any particular any questions that something that's somebody would like to, or any topic that somebody wants me to bring up or expand on more?
Yes, Trey, we have a question about the basic steps of an admin scale. You've mentioned that, and I was wondering if you could review that briefly. Or the question says, could we
Oh,
review
well,
that briefly?
yeah, I mean, there's a whole lecture that I did, like an hour 40-minute lecture that I did on an admin scale, how to create an admin scale, what the basic understanding of it is. And I would recommend that people look at that. But you can you can look at times just to in a nutshell, you can look at times in your life when you were happy and satisfied with what was going on. And you can look at what there was a lot of around you in the environment at that time that you were either creating or experiencing from the creation of your other dynamics, like a mate, or like on the second dynamic could be a girl you dated and really felt great around, or it could be a team you were part of, like a chorus or a football team or something like that. These are where people experience uh, the other dynamics in a very high RC way. And then you can look at see, well, what was there around a lot at those times. And that gives you your basic goal. And then you can look at, well, what kind of what qualities in a person would I most like to have that would most likely make me happy? And, it might come up with different things like competence would be one thing, high affinity would be another thing. Uh, just uh, well, motherly instinct. Somebody wants to be a wife. Not everybody wants to be a wife. You have to find these things out, and that's where your admin scale comes in. Your priorities and your dynamics. Some guys want to just travel around the world. The family and mate would be way low on their priorities. They want to be in the army. It's very tough. Oh, well, I mean, you could be married in the army, of course, but I mean, if you want to be in active duty and be gone all the time, and that might be not okay with your wife. So yeah, it's very important to establish your own goals and purposes. That gives you your qualifications for what is and what isn't the right thing to connect to in the first place. A lot of errors in life come from connecting with the wrong things because you connect at the level of non-existence. But when you connect with the wrong thing, you immediately go into liability because you've taken on something that undermines your goals by its very presence. Is blocking something that you should be doing or should be having. So, but I would recommend listening to that lecture because it gives you a really detailed a really detailed way of accomplishing creating an admin scale. I've done probably 10,000 hours of admin scales with people. It's a great thing to do. It really helps. And often I get people coming back years later say, boy, that really I really helped a lot. Even if they haven't looked at it, it's really interesting. They look at it a year later and they tell me, well, I didn't really even look at it so much after we finished, but I looked at it like a year later. I found it in my papers and I found I'd done all the things that were on the admin scale. It becomes part of your executive ability of planning, programming, putting things in sequence, getting things done. It just naturally happens because your attention and your intention is focused on the things you really want rather than distractions and off-purpose things and opponent type things. Does that answer that question?
I think that's great, Trey. Yeah, we'll have a look at that.
Okay.
I think we looked at that too when we did we formed the OTA, the OT Association.
Yeah, we have an
Yeah,
admin scale for our group.
we did. Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions? Remember, the 2D isn't just about a relationship with a spouse or other person. It is also about children, other family members. Uh, those questions apply too. And you can unmute yourself if you like at this point and ask a question, or you can type it into the chat.
Well, one other thing I could mention is this is a question that comes up often with me is people talk about their soulmate or their twin flame or looking for their soulmate and I really understand that. LRH talks about it. He says that kind of 2D, that kind when you find somebody you believe is your soulmate or you have that reaction to, he says it's either, well, the thing that everybody knows is that's a PTS thing. Well, that's one thing that he says in one place, but then in another place he says there's two other things it could be. And I find often it's one of those other two things. It's either a PTS connection, as already says, but that would be demonstrated by intense roller coaster and bitter fights interspersed with intense passion. That's your PTS condition. The other one is somebody that you've got a whole track decision or bonding with. So you meet somebody and you instantly feel bonded with them or potentially bonded with them. It could be a whole track postulate coming to life again. And the third thing, which most people don't realize, is that LRH says it can also be somebody that's just on your wavelength. You don't necessarily have to have known them in a past life or, have some sort of tragic past 2D or nothing like that. It's just, but that isn't necessarily even a mate. Of course, you can have a lot of friends. They're on your wavelength. They seem to understand you. They know what you're going to say, but they still listen to you. And but when you find that in somebody who's a potential mate that has these other qualities, boy, you really got something going, because that means that you can coordinate and align much more easily than somebody that you're not really aligned with. So that's a common question, and I thought it would be useful to clarify that.
Hi, Trey.
All right.
I had a question.
Okay.
I wonder what your take on, or your wisdom, which I always love, about how the second dynamic in the culture now, all this gender, what's going on, how it's been, sort of taken apart and also bled into the other dynamics where it's it's all about, it's politics, it's third dynamic, it's fourth dynamic, and the genders being disassembled and just sort of your take on that and how to live with it, live in the society that's doing that at this time as well, and any advice you have on that.
Well, I think that, living in, well, LRH talked about this and he saw this. He wrote extensively about it back in the 60s, because these were the people that were always attacking Scientology, which in itself tells you something, where Scientology is an op term. And why is Scientology an op term? Well, because Scientology op terms the reactive mind, and the reactive mind becoming downloaded and becoming realities in the environment gets a life of its own because of increased group agreement. Now, he talked about society becoming a drug society, and you find that there's a big push to increase drug use, to legalize drugs. Not just street drugs, but I mean the tremendous use of psych drugs, mood drugs, those kind of things. And one of the goals of the secular progressives, which LRH labels as the enemy, is to unmock the nuclear family. In countries that have been taken over by this ideology, the state becomes the parent, and or the father at least, and the marriage itself is undermined to the point where in some Scandinavian cities, in Norway and Sweden, marriage has pretty much disappeared. Women they're living together, but they don't get married, or they have kids, and they just have, they're associated with the children's father, but they're not really married. They don't create a strong family. Now, you find in societies with a weak central government, the family becomes very strong, like in Asia mostly, because the central government never really, they were strong, but there was so much instability that the only people you could really rely on was your family. And so family became all important. In areas where the government became all important, the families kind of tended to disappear. So, defending yourself of that kind of environmental undermining requires becoming aware of it, realizing what it is. Because more and more people started using drugs in the 60s, they grew up and they are dramatizing drug realities. And as they grew up, they went from being, college students smoking dope every day, to graduate students, to professors, to administrators of universities, got their way into business and got their way into high executive positions, and they got into government, they got into the law. There used to be a joke that marijuana would have to be legalized eventually because so many lawyers were smoking it. So there's been a great increase in agreement on drug realities. And one of those drug realities is, look at all of the things that were considered to be, well, you hear a lot about marginalized communities. Well, LRH would say that probably 20% of society should be marginalized. Why? Well, because they're antisocial and their values and actions undermine the 80%. Now, in a really bad situation, you can get as little as 7 or 8% of a society controlling the rest of it because they're ruthless and instill fear in everybody. And most social personalities want to survive, so they tend to kind of go along as long as they're not being personally affected that much. But in the Russian Revolution, 1914, the Bolsheviks were a small part of even the communists. Most of them were Mensheviks or other groups. The Bolsheviks were just the most ruthless and brutal and hardcore, and they ended up dominating the government when they only had 6 or 7% agreement. So it can happen. You don't need a majority. So, defending the family against this kind of onslaught does require just becoming aware of what it is. You don't have to react to it. You don't have to oppose it. You just have to be diligent on mending your fences and creating your own reality and maintaining every home should be a bubble that's free from that kind of intrusion. And, for that matter, your own space should be kind of a bubble, not the kind of bubble that keeps things in or out, but your own safe space. You're safe with yourself. You're safe with your family. They're safe with you. And, you make friends. You make friends that you're safe with and that feel safe with you, that you support them, they support you. And that's the only real way. LRH says, creating little bubbles and, islands of sanity, and then eventually getting those islands to connect, you get bigger islands of sanity. That's what we're trying to do with the OTA. That's what we're trying to do here is connecting up all these little islands of sanity in society, and really hoping that that kind of group agreement can expand rather than the R6 bank agreement of drugs, aberration, violence, license, just the war against law and order, basically. So it's out there. It's getting worse, but last thing I'll say is that one thing Ellerich says about trends, it's a trend, okay? One thing he says about trends is that all trends flow until they reverse. Personally, I feel we're on the edge of a reversal. But he says all flows have a counterflow. So while this flow has been building, we've had a counterflow of creating islands of sanity. And if we become the flow, then there'll be a counterflow, which is the opposition that never goes away, but gets reduced down to an irreducible minimum of the mostly antisocial and particularly the 2.5% truly dangerous are in fact truly correctly marginalized. You're not going to marginalize people because of their sex, race, national origin, or anything else. You're going to marginalize people who are criminals or antisocial or promoting things that kill people, like drugs. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you.
Thanks, Trey.
Hey, Trey, there's one little thing I had here about affinity that it says it was one of the earlier slides, express affinity often and watch for anything that reduces it in a 2D. For example, third party withholds and body roots. And I was wondering if you could back up a little and address that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I didn't
Thank
delve
you.
into that much. But one thing that's very important, and again, it comes up in couples counseling a lot, is initially there's a lot of romance and going out on dates and doing things together. Usually, typically, when it could either be getting so busy with business or the family, the children, that you end up not really creating any time for each other. Like all the conversation is about the kids or about work, or you come home dog tired, watch TV, have a beer, and go to sleep. That's the typical person that you get up, you go to work, come home, you have something to eat, you don't have a beer, watch TV, go to sleep. Do that next day, go to sleep. Next day, go to sleep. So that's pretty typical. And if you don't create time for each other, then it tends to weaken the affinity bond. So it's always good to either have a time a day, a day of the week, an evening or two that you spend time together, where it's just the two of you. It's not you and her and the kids. It's just the two of you. Now, again, what I find with uh, marriage counseling is that the body ruse is a really important thing, because if a person isn't getting enough sleep, if they go to work tired, they come back really tired, they tend to be more irritable and easily keyed in. So when you bring up controversial subjects, it tends to go badly. So being able to, and again, it comes back to this earlier point where your first dynamic should be in good condition in order to have a good second dynamic. Good condition also means your own responsibility for, being well fed, well rested, healthy, not being, uh, handling stress effectively so that you're not super stressed out all the time. All those things tend to reduce affinity when they're present. Third parties has to be watched out for too. The reason why that hasn't gotten more play is people don't understand. They think that a third party has to be a specific person telling your wife that you're a dog and she should leave you immediately. It isn't necessarily that. That happens quite a lot, especially with single women. They date somebody and things aren't going great. Well, rather than finding why that is, and if it's a fatal flaw or just simply a misunderstanding, they complain to their friends at lunch, their friends, all of whom have bad marriages or bad 2Ds, and then take advice like, yeah, dump the bastard, uh, you don't take advice from somebody who doesn't have a successful 2D, because why would you? And interestingly enough, psychologists, until maybe about 10, 15 years ago, they never studied successful marriages. They only studied unsuccessful marriages. So all their information had to do with unsuccessful marriages, but they never really got to the bottom of it. What basics were out and how can you put those basics in and repair something? So, some of their advice was decent. I mean, nothing wrong with some of it, but it didn't really hone in on the real importances. But anyway, what a third party is a basic thing is you ask this guy, well, how do you feel? Not how do you feel about your wife or your girlfriend? How do you feel about women? What are they like? What are women like? Well, or to the guy, what are men like? What do men always do? Oh, men always blah, blah, blah. Or yeah, women are like this, they blah, 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 and they do that, and they sooner or later, Anyway, that comes from third party. Where did they get these ideas? Is it their own experience, or did they listen to somebody who said, watch out for women because they'll always screw you in the end? Or screw you in the beginning. Well, that's not all bad, but it's kind of a bad indicator by itself. But anyway, that's third party. What is the it goes back to GPMs. What is the identity that you overlay on the person who is your mate? You think of her as a wife or a woman or a mother. So you can have many prior considerations about a mother or what a mother should do, what you have to watch out for with a mother, what you have to defend against yourself with a mother. Certainly, we've all had experiences that people go into a mode of defending themselves from something you're not doing. Well, that comes about because they may not have an idea that they have, well, kind of like somebody who's always accusing their husband of cheating on them or accusing their wife of cheating on them. Well, I've audited guys who just swear up and down it's just completely made up. Well, yeah, I believe that, but where is this coming from? Well, it could come from third party, earlier bad experiences, could come from their own similar rudes. I've handled women who had big complaints about their ex-boyfriend by asking, well, what did they do that was so bad? And they would go, they did this, that, and the other. And so I said, okay, great. So I took them up and they said, well, did you ever do that to anybody? He said, oh, yeah, I did that too, And then by the time I got to the third thing, they were laughing and the whole thing blew. So, anyway, that's all on that.
Wow.
Okay, thanks, Trey. All right, well, are there any other questions? I think, Ankit, did you get your question answered in the chat? I think Trey just answered it. That third party can come from a lot of different areas. Let's see here. Ah, yes, exactly. Thank you. Good. That's good to know. Any other?
Realities you've been
Oh.
exposed to that allure your affinity. We could define it that way, and it gives you a lot more fertile, it makes it more fertile to look at, and you can get some real good answers from that.
Okay. Two that reduce affinity. Okay. I'm taking notes. All righty. Are there any other questions? All right. Well, then I'm going to go forward on a couple of slides here. All right. Before we get into wins, I want to talk about our next Indie Bridge event. It's a general panel discussion on life as an OT. And a lot of people are curious about what OT is and how OTs are and what our different viewpoints are. So that's going to be our discussion. It's a panel discussion and a Q&A, Saturday, August 5th, 2023, at same time, Saturday, 10 a.m. Pacific or Cupertino time for you Apple users out there. And if you have any questions that you'd like to have addressed at this event, just send them to info@indiebridge.org, and we'll be happy to make them a point that the panel will answer. All right, time for a win.